The ocean sparkled that summer morning, waves crashing like thunder against the shore. Families laughed, lifeguards scanned the horizon, and seagulls circled above. But beneath the warm sun, tension brewed. A 14-year-old black teenager sat quietly near the rocks, notebook in hand, while privileged vacationers whispered and smirked behind their sunglasses. To them, he didn't belong. They saw only what they wanted, not who he was. Then, in the blink of an eye, a little girl vanished beneath the surf. Screams tore through the beach. A millionaire's daughter was drowning, and the lifeguards were too far away. The boy everyone ignored stood first, because when danger struck, it wasn't strength, wealth, or privilege that mattered. It was courage, and only Darius had enough of it. Before we dive into this story, tell me, have you ever witnessed someone underestimated, only to prove stronger than anyone imagined? Stay with me, because what you'll discover about this boy at the end will leave you speechless. Darius Carter was no stranger to feeling like an outsider. At 14, his life had been shaped less by comfort and more by resilience. He grew up on the tougher side of town, in a neighborhood where the paint peeled from old wooden porches and sirens often sang louder than lullabies. His mother, working 2 jobs, did everything she could to keep food on the table. His father had left years ago, leaving behind only a cracked photograph in a shoebox and questions Darius no longer bothered asking. Despite the struggles, Darius carried himself with a quiet strength. His eyes were sharp, his smile rare but genuine, and his mind constantly racing with dreams bigger than the block he lived on. At school, teachers often remarked on his intelligence, but too many classmates only saw the color of his skin and the scuffed sneakers on his feet. To them, he was invisible until they wanted a target for their jokes. Music was his escape. Late at night, when the city lights flickered outside his window, Darius would practice dance routines he learned from old YouTube videos. He had a rhythm in his bones, a way of moving that seemed to tell stories words couldn't. On cracked sidewalks or in the schoolyard after the final bell, he would let himself go, feet tapping, arms swinging, head locked into the beat only he could hear. For Darius, dance wasn't just movement. It was survival, a language the world couldn't twist or silence. But his world wasn't easy. Each day came with its share of subtle slights. At the corner store, eyes followed him too closely, as if a 14-year-old with 3 crumpled dollars in his hand could rob the place. Walking through the park, older kids sometimes shouted words that stung, words designed to remind him of his place. He had learned to ignore them, or at least pretend he could, but deep inside, the weight of those moments piled up like bricks. On weekends, his mother insisted he take a break from the neighborhood. "Go somewhere nice," she'd say, pressing a few dollars into his palm. "Don't let this world box you in." That's how he found himself at the beach that fateful day. The ocean, vast and endless, gave him a rare sense of freedom. Its waves didn't care where he came from. Its tides didn't judge, but people did. From the moment Darius stepped onto the warm sand, he felt eyes on him. Not the curious kind, not the friendly kind. Eyes that measured and dismissed. Eyes that whispered behind sunglasses and parasols. He carried a faded backpack, wore swim trunks that had seen better days, and held a towel frayed at the edges. Around him, families lounged under expensive umbrellas, coolers packed with more food than his kitchen often held. At first, he tried to ignore it. He placed his towel down at the far edge of the beach, near the dunes, away from the clusters of wealthy families. He stretched, looked out at the ocean, and let himself imagine he belonged. But the murmurs carried on. The wind reached his ears anyway. A couple with matching sun hats shook their heads as if his very presence spoiled their day. Teenagers nearby snickered and pointed, their laughter sharp enough to pierce. Darius forced himself to focus on the water. The waves called to him, and he stepped in, the cool rush against his skin washing away, if only briefly, the sting of being unwelcome. For a few precious minutes he swam freely, letting the salt sting his eyes and the currents push him around. In the water, he was just another kid, weightless and alive. But back on shore, the stares never left. Parents pulled their children closer when he walked by, as if danger clung to him like a shadow. A group of boys about his age deliberately kicked sand near his towel. pretending it was an accident. He didn't respond. He never did. But the message was clear. He didn't belong here, not in their eyes. Still, Darius wasn't the type to give up his ground. He returned each weekend, sometimes with his sketchbook, sometimes just to sit and listen to the waves. And each time the treatment was the same: quiet hostility, disguised smiles that weren't smiles at all. What they didn't know was that one day, the boy they dismissed, the boy they mocked, would change everything. And there was one detail, something almost invisible, that foreshadowed it. That afternoon, as Darius spread out his towel, his sharp eyes noticed a girl sitting under a large striped umbrella. She wasn't laughing like the others. She wasn't sneering or whispering. She was just watching. In her wheelchair, with her father standing nearby, she seemed out of place too, though for very different reasons. Her gaze held something Darius rarely saw in strangers: curiosity without judgment. That girl's name was Emily Whitaker, daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the city, and before the day was over, their worlds would collide in a way that no one, least of all the crowd who despised him, could have imagined. But here's the shocking part you'll want to remember. The same people who laughed at Darius for daring to step onto their beach would soon owe him more than they could ever repay. And what he discovered that day wouldn't just save a life, it would uncover a truth buried deep beneath the sand. The sun blazed higher over the shoreline as Darius Carter sat quietly on his frayed towel, trying to lose himself in the sound of the waves. He tugged at the edges of his swim trunks, embarrassed that they were faded and patched in places. A group of teenage boys about his age, loud, tanned, and dressed in the latest brand-name gear, passed by. They glanced at him, smirks spreading across their faces. One nudged the other and said something under his breath. All three erupted into laughter. Darius kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. He'd learned not to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But the beach crowd wasn't subtle. Snickers turned to comments. Comments turned to whispers that weren't whispers at all. Doesn't belong here. Probably up to no good. Look at him. Bet he didn't pay to park. The words sank in, familiar yet still sharp. He told himself to stay calm, to remember why he came. The sea, the space to breathe, the reminder that life could be bigger than the block he came from. Across the sand, Emily Whitaker, the girl in the wheelchair, kept glancing his way. Her father, Richard Whitaker, a tall man in a pressed white shirt and expensive sunglasses, barely noticed Darius. His gaze remained fixed on business calls, pacing near their umbrella as he barked into his phone. But Emily, she watched. She noticed the way the boys mocked Darius, the way adults pulled their children closer, the way the air seemed to turn against him. Something inside her stirred, a sense of injustice she couldn't quite name. Darius waded back into the water. Here, at least, he felt weightless. He floated on his back, staring at the endless sky until he drifted too far from shore. The lifeguard blew a whistle, waving him back. As he swam, he felt the current tug harder than usual. He struggled against it, his arms aching, but he pushed through, returning to shallow water. On shore, a few people laughed as if his near struggle had been a performance. His chest burned, not from the swim, but from the cruelty of it all. By mid-afternoon, the beach grew crowded. Umbrellas dotted the sand like bright confetti. Children shrieked with joy in the waves, and vendors shouted over the din. Darius tried sketching in his notebook, his pencil scratching across the page as he drew waves and seagulls. But peace never lasted. The same group of boys returned. One accidentally kicked sand onto his towel. Another snatched at his sketchbook, pretending to look at the drawings before tossing it into the sand. "Hey!" Darius snapped, scrambling to brush it off. "Relax, man," one boy sneered. "We're just having fun." But their eyes told a different story. This wasn't fun, it was domination. It was a reminder that he wasn't welcome. Emily's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair. She wanted to say something, to tell them to stop, but fear held her tongue. She glanced at her father, but he was too absorbed in his phone call to notice. Darius bit his lip, swallowed his anger, and told himself to endure. But the fire in his chest grew hotter. Later, when he ventured near the pier to buy a soda, A woman selling ice cream eyed him with suspicion. "Don't touch the cooler," she warned sharply, even though he hadn't. "I'm just buying a drink," he said quietly, sliding coins onto the counter. Her smile was thin. "False." "Of course," she replied, as if the act of paying didn't quite clear him of her assumptions. By the time the sun began to lower, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and gold, the weight of the day pressed hard on Darius. He thought about leaving early, but something inside him refused to run. He'd taken enough from this world already. This beach was public. This ocean belonged to no one. He would stay. That decision changed everything. From her spot under the umbrella, Emily wheeled herself forward, closer to the water's edge. She had grown restless watching, restless from silence. The sand made it difficult, her wheels sinking, but she pushed hard. For the first time, she caught Darius's eyes. It wasn't long, just a glance, but enough for both of them to recognize something unspoken. Understanding. The moment was brief, because in the next heartbeat, chaos erupted. A shriek tore through the air. Heads whipped toward the surf. A little boy, no older than 7, had been caught in the rip current, his small body dragged farther and farther out. His mother screamed from the shore, rushing toward the water but stopping short when the waves threatened to pull her in too. The lifeguard, stationed at the far end, blew his whistle and sprinted, but he was too far, too slow. The crowd froze. Gasps and shouts filled the air, but no one moved. They hesitated, calculating risk, waiting for someone else. Darius didn't wait. Before his mind even caught up, his feet were already pounding across the sand. He dove into the surf, arms cutting through the waves with practiced strength. The current was brutal, but he had already faced it earlier. This time, he swam harder, faster, driven not by escape, but by determination. The crowd gathered, stunned. Some shouted for him to stop, others doubted he could make it. But Emily's eyes shone wide, her hands trembling on her wheels. Darius reached the boy, grabbing him just as another wave crashed over them. The child sputtered, panicked, but Darius held on, kicking furiously to keep them both afloat. On shore, silence stretched like a held breath. Then, movement. The lifeguard finally arrived, diving in and meeting them halfway. Together, he and Darius dragged the boy to safety, collapsing onto the wet sand as the child coughed and cried into his mother's arms. For a moment, relief swept the crowd. Applause even broke out, scattered, hesitant, but quickly the old suspicion crept back. "Did you see that? He went out there too fast. Maybe he pushed the boy in first." "I don't trust it." The murmurs cut deeper than any wave. Darius sat there, dripping wet, chest heaving, staring at the same people who had mocked him hours before. He had risked his life, and still, doubt poisoned their eyes. Richard Whittaker finally looked up from his phone, annoyance flashing across his face as he realized his daughter was rolling closer to the scene. His gaze landed on Darius. Dark, wet, exhausted, and hardened instantly, but Emily's expression was the opposite. Awe, respect, gratitude. Darius stood, brushing sand from his skin, and caught her looking. For the second time that day, their eyes met, and this time it wasn't just understanding. It was connection. The crowd dispersed slowly, but the whispers never stopped. Darius returned to his towel, water dripping into the sand, his chest still burning. He told himself he didn't care what they thought. He had done what was right. But deep inside, he wondered, would they ever see him for who he truly was? That night, when he walked home under a dim streetlight, the ocean still echoing in his ears, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger had begun. Because what happened on that beach wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The beach had quieted, but the day's events hung heavy in everyone's memory. For Darius Carter, the weight felt doubled. Saving that child should have been enough to prove his heart, but prejudice rarely surrendered so easily. He knew it. He felt it in the stares that followed him, in the suspicion etched across Richard Whittaker's face. The next afternoon, Darius returned. Something inside him refused to let yesterday be the last word. He spread his towel on the sand, ignored the whispers, and told himself the ocean didn't judge. Emily Whittaker rolled her chair closer again. Her father frowned but said nothing, too busy scrolling through business emails. Emily's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "You were brave." It was the first time she'd spoken to him, and the words carried more weight than applause ever could. Darius only nodded, humbled, unsure if speaking would break the fragile thread of connection between them. But peace never lasts long in a place poisoned by bias. As the tide swelled, Emily's wheelchair edged closer to the surf. She wanted to feel the spray, to taste freedom beyond her confinement. Richard turned away to take a call, assuming she was safe. No one noticed as the sand beneath her wheels shifted, tilting, pulling her toward the waves. By the time she realized, it was too late. The chair lurched forward, tipped, and Emily plunged into the foaming water. A scream ripped through the air. Her father dropped his phone, sprinting, but panic and the rushing tide slowed him. The crowd gasped, frozen. Again, hesitation held them prisoner. But not Darius. He was already running, muscles burning, legs pounding across the sand. The memory of the current from yesterday seared into his mind. He knew its danger, its pull. But this wasn't about fear. This was about life. The ocean swallowed Emily once, twice, her arms flailing, her voice drowned by the roar of the sea. Then Darius reached her. He grabbed hold, his strength fighting against the chair, dragging her deeper. Salt water filled his mouth, waves battered his back, but he held her tighter. The crowd erupted. Some shouted encouragement, others doubt. "He can't do it." "It's too heavy." Richard waded in, screaming his daughter's name, but the waves shoved him back. He was powerless. Darius wasn't. With one desperate surge, he unclasped the chair's straps, yanked Emily free, and pulled her against his chest. She coughed, sputtered, but clung to him as he kicked, every stroke a war against the ocean's fury. His lungs screamed for air, his body shook with exhaustion, but he refused to let go. Finally, the tide relented. Together they collapsed onto the shore, Emily safe but trembling. Richard fell to his knees beside them, tears streaking his face as he pulled his daughter into his arms. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then the whispers began again. Different this time. He saved her. That boy saved her life. He's a hero. But Richard's face told a more complicated story. Gratitude warred with pride, shame with relief. He looked at Darius, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a threat, not as an outsider, but as the boy who had done what no one else could. And yet, even as his lips parted, no words came. Prejudice doesn't shatter in an instant. It bends, it fractures, but it fights to survive. The crowd clapped now, louder than yesterday, but Darius didn't care about applause. He only cared about the girl who had trusted him with her life, and about proving, to himself more than anyone, that he was more than the world's cruel assumptions. But in that moment, as Richard's eyes locked with his, Darius knew the hardest battle wasn't with the ocean. It was with hearts hardened by hate. The beach slowly returned to its rhythm, waves rolling, gulls circling, families murmuring. But for those who had witnessed it, nothing felt the same. Emily clung to her father, shivering but alive. Her gaze flicked back to Darius, who stood dripping wet, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but emotion clogged her throat. All she managed was a trembling smile. Richard Whittaker finally found his voice. He placed a trembling hand on his daughter's shoulder, then looked at Darius. Gratitude flickered in his eyes, but so did discomfort, the kind of discomfort that comes when one's worldview cracks. For years, Richard had measured people by wealth, by appearances, by the circles they belonged to. And here was a boy who had none of that. No money, no privilege, no polished reputation, yet he had given Richard something priceless, his daughter's life. The crowd dispersed in hushed tones, whispering not of mockery this time, but of awe. Darius had proven himself in front of everyone. But as he gathered his worn towel and notebook, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a quiet longing that maybe, someday, people wouldn't see him as a threat first and a person second. Emily called out softly, her voice thin but determined. "Darius." He paused. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 words. Simple, but weighty enough to pierce through every barrier between them. He nodded once, managing a small smile, then turned to leave. Richard watched him go, his jaw tight. He wanted to say something, perhaps even offer gratitude, but the words stuck. Admitting he was wrong meant more than just thanking a boy. It meant unlearning everything he thought he knew. And that was a war within himself he wasn't ready to fight. Not yet, but Emily was. She stared at Darius until he disappeared beyond the dunes, a quiet resolve blooming inside her. She would remember him, tell his story, carry it forward, and here lies the truth, the shocking twist hinted at from the beginning. For years, the Whitaker family would be known not just for their wealth, but for the story of the day a teenage boy no one respected became the reason their daughter lived. Emily herself would grow to tell it often, her voice filled with admiration. As for Darius Carter, that moment didn't just save Emily. It reshaped his own future. It became proof that courage and compassion can outshine cruelty. Proof that even when the world mocks you, belittles you, or shuts its doors, you can still rise and leave a mark that prejudice can never erase. And maybe that's the greatest power of all. Because here's the question that lingers. How many more lives could change if we judged people not by the color of their skin, not by their clothes or where they came from, but by their actions, their courage, and their humanity? The answer lies with us. If this story moved you, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Watch our previous video for another powerful story of courage and injustice. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps these stories reach the world, where they can spark change in ways we may never imagine.